Just going to read one chapter from the book of Job. It's chapter 28. And it's where the author of Job is speaking here. He's talking about what actually constitutes real wisdom, and that's the main theme for this morning. There is a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from ore. Man puts an end to the darkness. He searches the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. Far from where people dwell, he cuts a shaft. In places forgotten by the foot of man, far from men, he dangles and sways. The earth from which food comes is transformed below as by fire. Sapphires come from its rocks, and its dust contains nuggets of gold. No bird of prey knows that hidden path. No falcon's eye has seen it. Proud beasts do not set foot on it, and no lion prowls there. Man's hand assaults the flinty rock and lays bare the roots of the mountains. He tunnels through the rock, his eyes see all its treasures. He searches the sources of the rivers and brings hidden things to light. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Man does not comprehend its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, "It's not in me." The sea says, "It is not with me." It cannot be bought with the finest gold, nor can its price be weighed in silver. It cannot be bought with the gold of Ophir, with precious onyx or sapphires. Neither gold nor crystal can compare with it, nor can it be had for jewels of gold. Coral and jasper are not worthy of mention. The price of wisdom is beyond rubies. The topaz of Cush cannot compare with it. It cannot be bought with pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds of the air. Destruction and death say, only a rumour of it has reached our ears. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, then he looked at wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and tested it. And he said to man, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." Right, well, I hope people have had a chance to sort of at least look at the notes, and therefore you've got a general picture of the background of the book of Job. And I hope in particular that everybody's familiar with chapters 1 and 2, which we suggest it would be a good idea to read before this morning's meeting. So, okay, we've got the picture. This is the story of a man who was living under the hedge of God's protection, because even Satan acknowledged that. He said, yeah, no wonder he's so good. You've put a hedge around him. I can't get anywhere near him. He's habitually lived there. He's lived within the hedge of that protection. He's been enjoying great blessing. He's been prosperous. He's been wealthy. He's had a great family life. He's had good reputation, he's been respected and admired. He's actually a thoroughly successful man, and then there's this sudden catastrophic reversal, and his circumstances change without warning, without explanation, without any idea why this is going on, and all his comfort vanishes, everything has fallen apart, and Job is plunged into suffering of every conceivable kind. physical, mental, social, economic, emotional, spiritual, the whole range of it. He's suffering to a far greater extent than the average man. We all know that everybody gets their share of the ups and downs, but Job has suddenly been hit with something which is inexplicable. And the talk of all the surrounding countryside, why on earth has this happened to this good man? He's lost everything. He's suffering the pain of that, and then, the second round, he even loses his health as well. But more than that, everything he believes in is being challenged here. It's a complete reversal, not only of his comforts, but it's brought into a question his faith. Why is God doing this to him? And to cap it all, God feels very far away at this point. Now, we need to mention, because we're given a bit of insight that Job doesn't get, we get a little glimpse behind into what was going on in heavenly realms. Job never gets to hear that. So we know that actually it's not true that God's far away. We know that God is very aware of Job. And furthermore, we also know that even though he's allowed Satan access at this point for unfathomable purposes beyond Job's understanding, God is actually limiting what Satan can do, which is always an encouraging thing to remember. What we're told in 1 Corinthians, that no temptation has overtaken you that isn't common to man, and that actually God will never let you be tempted beyond what you're able to bear. He will always provide you with a way through it, so that you are able to stand up under it. That's important to know. God is very much in charge, even though for Job it was beginning to seem like, well, either he isn't in charge or he's very different from what I thought he was like. So then we have the attempt to wrestle with this riddle. Why do bad things happen to good people? And both Job and all his friends are completely baffled by this one. You see, they're used to having everything nice and tidy. When it's kind of the summer of life, and everything's going well, nobody asks, what is the meaning of suffering? Doesn't tend to be a big problem while everything's going smoothly for me. We don't say, why am I so blessed? It's when things are going horribly wrong, we're thinking, why is this happening? And for Job's friends, this is actually just as terrifying as it is for Job. Because let's face it, if it's really true, as Job says, I haven't done anything to deserve this, actually. He's not saying he's the perfect human or that he's an unfallen man or anything like that, but he's saying he's a man of righteousness and integrity who's set his life to follow God. And he hasn't actually rebelled, turned against God, knowingly sinned and done something that has caused all this, which is what his friends are increasingly assuming. Well, of course, if you take that on board, hey, guess what? It could happen to you. It could happen to me. There's no guarantees. That's quite frightening. And so we see through these long chapters of discourses, which you'll probably be relieved to know I'm not going to wade through today. There's not much point, because a lot of what's said in it is not actually God's word, it's men wrestling with what God is doing. But through all that, you can see people striving to understand, striving to get a handle on it, striving to find some way that you could get an insurance policy that will mean that this doesn't happen to me. And of course, the only way they can do that is by passing very harsh judgment on Job. Because clearly he must have done something terrible, otherwise this wouldn't have happened. Because we all know the wisdom principles that you find, like in the book of Proverbs, things which are wise, they are sensible, they are generally true. It is generally true that if you handle your money well, you won't get into debt. It is generally true that if you conduct your relationships with kindness, honesty, integrity, you will get on well and have friends. It is generally true that if you eat healthily and exercise sensibly, you'll have reasonably good health. That is general truth, well worth putting into practice. But it is not a guarantee that nothing bad will ever touch you. Paul says, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. That is absolutely true, although sometimes the reaping is not here and now. But what Job's friends made the mistake of is that they assumed the reverse was true, that whatever you're reaping, you obviously must have sown. Not true. That song in The Sound of Music, you know, that here you are standing here loving me, whether or not you should. So somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good, because nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. Actually, that's rubbish. We don't get blessed because, I must have done something good. Well, not unless you think like a Buddhist or a Hindu. That must mean that in a previous life, I've done something really good. That's why I'm so blessed now. And I don't need to worry too much about my brother who's going through a tough time, because obviously he did something in a previous life that was really bad. And so it's not my fault or my concern. Not very satisfying, but some people think like that. It's not biblical. It's like in the 19th and early 20th century, syphilis was a major problem. There was an epidemic of it. And of course, there's a general truth there that if you live a very dissolute life, you could catch something like syphilis. And vast numbers of people had it because they lived a dissolute life of one sort or another. But you couldn't make the assumption that every case of syphilis was somebody who was morally loose. You could also get it if you were the innocent partner of somebody else who was morally loose. You could also get it if you were the innocent offspring of somebody who had it. So you see, although there are general principles for how to avoid syphilis, there was no cast iron guarantee, nor was there necessarily a moral judgment to be made of somebody who was suffering its consequences. Nowadays, of course, they have antibiotics, so that's not the big thing it used to be. Still wise to go the lifestyle that wouldn't have got it in the first place. Put it this way, if everybody on the planet followed God's instructions for what he created sex for, there would be no STDs. So, right. But for these men talking to Job, they really need it to be something they can hone down and get sorted. Because in the summer of my life, I can think that everything is nice and under my control, and what I want is a game plan that will bring about what I want. And obviously, if you want God's blessing, it wouldn't be wise to embrace stuff that he hates. But we're following one who went to a cross while living the absolute perfect life, so there's no guarantees. But what we do know is that there are two big questions in the book of Job. One of them is Satan's question, will Job fear God for nothing? In other words, you think Job loves you, but actually he's just serving his own interests. He knows which side his bread's buttered, and he knows that, if he does what you want, then it's cupboard love, God. He doesn't want you, he just wants your benefits. The other question is the author's own one. So where is wisdom to be found? What is it really? What is the secret to the wise life? And this is the question the author has posed in that chapter we just read. And that's sort of where I want to focus today. Next talk is going to be focusing on the heavenly realms. And we're going to be looking at what's going on in heavenly places while Job is going through all this on earth. But for today, I want to look at how Job saw it, how Job responded, what it did for Job. So that chapter we've just read, we find the author's talking about human skill and ingenuity. He's talking about the mining industry, saying, actually even the birds, with all their wonderful skills and abilities, they know nothing about what's going on under the earth. But, human beings with their intelligence, their God-given skills, they've got technological wisdom, they know about science, and they're always finding out new things, bringing treasures out of the earth. So there's that kind of wisdom, the wisdom that comes from scientific knowledge and know-how and studying. We've got the kind of practical everyday wisdom that Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar and Elihu were all so keen on, the sort of how to cope with daily life, good common sense. Yeah, men can have that. We also see some of the philosophizing that goes on, where they're trying to think, what's the meaning of it all? What's going on here? Is there a bigger picture? Is there a God? If there is, what's he like? We've got all those questions, the big questions that you kind of tend to ask either when you're sitting in an armchair in an ivory tower or when you're really going through the mill and wondering what on earth is going on here. But the author makes it very clear that you won't get to wisdom through any of that. None of that holds the secret, because all that, even its benefits, are something that's coming up from the earth. It's man searching, man thinking, man working out his opinions. And of course, men come up with lots of opinions. And in our day and age, when the notion of God as anybody who practically exists is much dismissed and frowned on, and in the current politically correct climate, the one thing you must never say is that God actually exists and is actually a person who will actually be who he'll be, whether we like him or not. In other words, you're saying actually God's right, we're wrong. Well, of course, that's the one thing you never ever say. Oh, no, you can't say you're wrong. You have a different perspective. You have a wider opinion. You're saying the opposite to me, but we could both be right. Well, sounds twaddle to me, but there we are. No, what the author of Job is underlining is that actually true wisdom doesn't come from us. Only God has that. He's the one who created this universe. In recent weeks, we've had several sermons in which we've touched again on the amazing complexity of creation. It's actually mind-bogglingly baffling. Even Stephen Hawking will say that, and I tell you, he's mind-bogglingly baffling to me when he starts talking about astrophysics and things. He sort of loses me within the first 10 seconds. But even he will say it is mind-bogglingly baffling. Even the most intelligent man on the planet can't get his head round it. And all the brightest brains, all they can do is they examine it more, they explore it more, they're sort of thinking, wow, the way this works, it's incredible. God is the one who thought it all up. Yeah. He's the one who made those laws. He's the one who put it all in motion and holds it all together. Now, when you're dealing with him, to me, it seems the height of arrogance to say, well, actually, I may have some wisdom that you don't seem to have. Sometimes I think you haven't quite thought out the consequences of the way you're running this universe. Sometimes I'd like to have a word with you and put you straight. How many of you saw that clip that was flying around social media of Stephen Fry being interviewed on the subject of what he would say if he was sort of at the pearly gates and asked why he should come in? And basically his answer was, A, he doesn't believe in pearly gates or God, and if he did, he'd have a thing or two to say to him. Well, Job wasn't quite like that, but he was saying, if only I could see him and I could talk to him, I could make him understand, that he's being unfair to me. Funnily enough, when Job actually sees him, that wasn't his reaction at all. And I'll tell you something, when Stephen Fry sees him, it won't be his either. the nub of it, of what wisdom is, we find stated several times in the book of Job. We read it earlier in chapter 28, the chapter on wisdom. He said to man, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." Now, does that echo with anybody who read the first two chapters? What about chapter 1, verse 1? "In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil." In chapter 8, we find what God said about Job. He said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." So from the outset, we're told that Job was a wise man. We're even told that God said Job was a wise man. And in chapter 2 and verse 3, after the first test has passed, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." So, just in case anybody was sort of getting some sympathy with some of the fairly plausible things that Job's friends were saying, no, God was not punishing Job. He was allowing him to be tested for purposes Job didn't understand. But God also knew just what Job could take. And I don't think God was in the least surprised to find that Job passed the test and was still maintaining his integrity and refusing to turn towards evil. Because, well, if you'd been through what I've been through, you'd know that it doesn't work either. And in the real world, we have to live in the real world's ways, and I'm turning away from God and towards evil. No. Job remains a man of integrity. And then ultimately, we find that he is told what the wisdom is, because God does actually speak to Job. He actually comes and speaks and answers him. Job gets what he's been praying for. If only I could see him. If only I could get the chance to put my case. If only he could explain to me. And Job does actually meet God. That's actually something very important to get. There are some times when it's only in the tough times we really get to know God. That actually there are some things that troubles and difficulties give to us that the sunshine and the summer will never give us. But actually God can make himself known to us. And he's personal and involved with us. But it is interesting when you look at God's reply to Job, you might think it's a bit unsatisfactory. For a start off, he doesn't tell him what we all know, that Satan was doing all this. He doesn't tell him about this test in the heavenly places. He doesn't tell him anything about the background stuff. None of that is, although it's not quite true. As we'll be seeing next time, he does actually give him a bit of a hint. But more of that in the next talk. So he doesn't say why it's happened, nor does he say, yeah, Job, you're right, as in all the things you've said. Because, some of the things Job said were also not true. They were his own wrestlings. But what God does is he reveals himself. He starts by answering Job. Let me read his first words here. "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge?" In other words, actually, you're talking outside your realm of experience and understanding. "Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." Oh, tables have turned suddenly. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it?" And he goes on and he talks like, who set all this universe in motion, Job? Oh, do you know about it? Do you understand all the mysteries of my creation? Have you given orders to the morning? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea? What's the way to the abode of light? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? It goes on and on and on. And he's basically saying, can you run this creation, Job? And he goes on to the animals. He says, do you hunt the prey for the lioness? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you provide for creatures like the wild ox and the wild donkey? Creatures which are a fat lot of use to any human being. You can't tame them and use them and harness their strength. They just exist for no benefit to anybody, it seems. And yet God delights in them and provides for them. What about the ostrich? He says, one of the funnier creatures. So daft, it doesn't even look after its eggs properly and it can't fly. But boy, have you seen it run? And it's like God's saying, here am I, I've created this incredible universe, an incredible diversity, and I delight in things. I've sent streams into a desert land where nobody's living. Oh, what was the point of that, God? What a waste of water. Let's send it where people need it. But no, God just delights to create, and God can create. And he's basically saying to Job, okay, you think you know a thing or two. And the Lord then turns to Job and says, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. And Job says, I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I've got no answer. But then God carries on again. And he talks about, are you going to discredit my justice to justify yourself? Basically, do you think I don't know about justice and wisdom? He's challenging Job. Do you trust me? Do you trust me? When you consider this earth I've created, and actually looking at that creation, it's not all about you, Job. There are lots of things within my creation that men never even see. But I see them, I delight in them. It's not actually for you, it's for me. And do you trust me to be just and righteous and good? You see, that's the thing. It's only people like us that have a problem about the meaning of suffering. If you think like Stephen Fry, that there is no God, it's all just meaningless, random chance, well, why should it be fair? Fair requires somebody who sort of values moral things, doesn't it? Well, if it's just random, blind, sort of nothing turned into something and turned into all this, well, there's no reason why it should be morally right. I mean, moral questions actually have no meaning if there is no one absolute moral principle at the centre of the universe. So he's basically saying to Job, could you do it better, Job? And our moaning and complaining, I think it was John Ortberg said, Job's very good at complaining. Most of us aren't. Do you think this is a skill we could all learn? We're all very good when it comes to the complaints. And the grumbling. You notice in any organisation, whoever's at the top of it, whether it's politics or industry or schools or whatever, whoever's the sort of the boss is always grumbled about by the people who aren't the boss, who could always do his job better until they get it, and then suddenly, everybody says, no, they're no good either. But no, God is saying to Job, I am who I am, and you can trust me. And the strange thing is that Job doesn't seem to have a problem anymore. His whole perspective has changed. He says, I'd heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent of all this dust and ashes I've been pouring forth. And the thing is that Job now knows God in a way he didn't before. And therefore, although his questions haven't been answered, it's like they don't matter so much anymore. I remember somebody once saying, sort of when we stand before God, will he answer will he give us all the answers and say, yeah, if you can remember the questions, because in the light of that they may actually disappear. And I'm going to sum up, just finishing up. You will have noticed at the end of the book of Job that the story has a nice, tidy, happy ending. And I'm not going to go into all that either, except to say there's one thing that is very noticeable. Job is vindicated, Job is secure, Job's fortunes are restored, and he's living under the blessing of God again. He gets back everything he had before and more. But there's a very interesting bit. Yes, he had another 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first, he's got the daughters are named, the sons are not. And it says of Job's daughters were the most beautiful women. You know, nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. That was very unusual in Job's culture. Daughters did not get an inheritance. Especially men with 7 sons, you know, they had enough to do giving the 7 sons an inheritance. But daughters, no. Daughters didn't get an inheritance. Daughters were kind of sold off as brides. You know, the person who wanted to marry them actually brought you a bride price. So you didn't give your daughters money, because then they were going off to be part of somebody else's family. You were giving away your family wealth. No, they didn't do that with daughters. But Job gave an inheritance to his daughters. Now, it's just one little inkling here that actually Job had learned to value what other people didn't value. That Job actually delighted in giving to people who wouldn't be sort of advancing his family's kudos in the next generation. They'd be in somebody else's family. Is it that Job was beginning to get the understanding of the one who looks after the wild donkey and the wild ox and waters the desert lands, and delights in things that men never even see, those creatures at the bottom of the sea, for example, that people don't even know exist. But somehow, in a sense, he's beginning to catch hold of God's delighted, prodigal, extravagant generosity, poured out just for the sheer joy of giving, that he loves just for the sheer joy of loving, that he cares because that's his nature, not because he's going to get something back from it, you know, like he really needs our worship. Now, actually, Job has caught hold of the fact that if you want to be like God, and if we're made in his image, that's what we're meant to be like, then we need to be generous givers, ready to share out. And we see that, in a way, Job remains, as God always knew he would, and as Satan suspected he wouldn't, a man of wisdom. He continues to worship God. He continues to shun evil. But he's actually getting increasingly awfully like the one he worships, and in whose image he was created. And maybe that is much more important to God than we have the slightest understanding of. That is the thing that really matters. So, to quote the book of Proverbs, if you get nothing else, get wisdom.